Well, hello, Resonate family. I hope you all have had a wonderful holiday season. As we count down to the end of 2024, I wanted to make a quick video to highlight my top 10 books of 2024. These are all books that I highly encourage you to read, as I believe that they will shape your mind and your heart just as they have shaped mine in this last year. If you're just interested in the list of books, you can skip to the very end of this video and that list will be up on a slide. At the end of 2023, I set a goal to read fewer books and better books in 2024. So I wanted to read a little bit less fiction and a little bit less popular level nonfiction. And I wanted to substitute that for more challenging academic and historical nonfiction, particularly theology and politics and things like that. And now that we're at the end of 2024, I would give myself a B minus grade on achieving that goal. I did read fewer books. So in 2023, I read 109 books. This year, I read 87 books. So I did read fewer books, and I did read some more challenging books. I spent some more time in my seminary textbooks and some other kind of Reformation era theology. But there were a few beasts on my bookshelf that I really wanted to get to this year and just didn't have the guts to get into it. And so in 2025, I'm doubling down on that same goal. I want to read fewer, better, harder books. So in a year, I'll update you on how I did in 2025. But before I get to the main list here, I want to make a few honorable mentions. So first, I did read some good fiction this year. I think fiction is at least as important as nonfiction in your reading diet. But even though it was less of an emphasis in my reading this year, it probably still made up like half of the books that I read. So here were some of my favorites that I read this year. First, the Terminal List series. I read all six of these. These books answer the question: what happens when a Navy SEAL has nothing to lose? They're good. They're entertaining. They keep you on the edge of your seat. I also read the Silo series by Hugh Howey. My friend Craig Lovelace turned me on to these, and they were excellent. The whole book is about what could an underground post-apocalyptic life look like. They were very good. And there's also I think a show on Apple TV or Amazon Prime that was all right, of the first book. And then I always read a lot of Stephen King. He's my favorite fiction author. So I read quite a bit of Stephen King this year. I read the Stand Extended Edition. So I read the normal version in 2018. It was one of my favorite Stephen King books back then. The extended version just gets better. It gets darker, it gets a little bit more graphic, but it just gets better. It clocks in at a little over 1,100 pages, so it takes a little while to get through, but it's worth it. I think it's one of the greatest stories, fiction stories of our lifetime. And then this year, Stephen King published a new collection of his short stories called "You Like It Darker," and those were great, kind of horror and thriller variety of short stories. Stephen King is not just a great novelist; he's a great short story writer. So that was some of my favorite fiction for this year. Um, I also want to give some nonfiction honorable mentions that didn't quite make the top 10 that I'm going to go through in a few minutes. So here's a few of them. The first is On Secular Education by R.L. Dabney. So over a century ago, R.L. Dabney prophetically anticipated the devastating trajectory of the government schooling project. In a way that I've only seen surpassed by C.S. Lewis, Dabney shows that true education is about the heart and the soul. It's not just about propositions and facts. And therefore, no secular government education can instill a Christian heart and a Christian soul into a child. The second was Vindiciae contra Tyrannos by Junius Brutus. This Huguenot classic, which this book has shaped Western political thought since its writing, it provides a biblical defense of the right of Christian subjects to resist their rulers, their political government rulers, even to the point of armed rebellion. And so the arguments presented in this book continue to be important for us today as we consider the limits and the powers of government. The third is The Age of Entitlement by Christopher Caldwell. So Caldwell is a journalist, and he provides a compelling case to show that some of the historical reforms of the 1960s, most notably the feminist movement and the civil rights movement, they were accomplished in such a way as it undermined the legal structure of the American judicial system. And this undermining has led to the degradation and collapse that we have observed in the last 20 years. So we are living in the after effects of the age of entitlement. It's an excellent and interesting book. The fourth is The Anxious Generation by Jonathan Haidt. So Jonathan Haidt puts his finger on the generational illness that is all around us. His primary finding is that Gen Z is far too overprotected in the physical world and far too underprotected in the digital world. And so to fix this, we have to commit to raising children with real world experiences and a much more limited digital playground. And then number five, The Toxic War on Masculinity by Nancy Pearcey. So Pearcey shows that contrary to the cultural talking points, biblical masculinity leads directly to the flourishing of both society in general and women in specific. And so antagonism toward masculinity comes at a tremendous cost to our world. But the main purpose of this video, so those are my honorable mentions, but the main purpose is to give you a list of the 10 most impactful books that I read in 2024. These weren't necessarily the books that I enjoyed the most or the books that I agreed with the most. These were the books that changed me most dramatically. I believe that books are the architects and construction workers of your intellectual world. And so if you read good ones, your mind becomes full and alive and sharp. But if you read bad ones or you don't read at all, your mind remains like a barren slab of concrete. It's shapeless, it's dull, it's limited. And so here are the top 10 books that affected my intellectual world in 2024. Number 10, How to Read a Book by Andy Naselli. Andy Naselli is a professor of systematic theology at Bethlehem Seminary in Minneapolis. And then for many years, he was the research assistant of D.A. Carson, who is widely regarded as one of the best read Christian thinkers alive today. So in this book, How to Read a Book, Naselli takes Mortimer Adler's famous work of the same name, some of you might be familiar with, and he makes it shorter, simpler, clearer, more modern, and explicitly Christian. So Naselli shows us that a well-read man is a complete man. And there's a world of difference between knowing how to sound out words and knowing how to mine the depths of writing for all of its meaning. Those are very different things. In an age where the vast majority of university students are functionally illiterate, this book is an excellent tool for us. Whether you're a graduate student working on your dissertation, or a budding theologian trying to find your feet, or a parent hoping to instill good reading habits in your children, I recommend this book by Andy Naselli. Here's a couple of my favorite quotes. He says, "A text's meaning is something you discover, not something you create." He also says, when Christ is king, he transforms how you approach reading, why you read, how you read, what you read, and when you read. If you're curious about this book, you can scan that QR code, and that's a video lecture that he gave that kind of summarizes the book in 1 hour form. So before you devote hours to reading it, you could check out that video. Number 9 is How to Pray by C.S. Lewis. This is a collection of essays and letters from the Oxford theologian, the medieval scholar, and this collection, it delivers the same cutting, logical, crystal clear thinking that you expect from C.S. Lewis if you've read him before. And he does it on a topic that is often muddled with vagary. It is hard to be clear when we talk about prayer. So in this book, Lewis addresses some of the most common questions that we have about prayer, like, can prayer be proven to work? Why should we pray if God already knows what we need? How does prayer fit with the idea of God's sovereignty? How should we handle unanswered prayers? There is no one better than Lewis at cutting through the noise and bringing light to things that are only obvious once you see them. So here are a few of my favorite quotes. Lewis says, "I pray because I can't help myself. I pray because I'm helpless. I pray because the need flows out of me all the time, waking and sleeping. It doesn't change God, it changes me." That's an excellent quote. Here's another one. This is a good example of his cutting logic that really clarifies things. He says, "There is no question whether an event has happened because of your prayer. When the event you prayed for occurs, your prayer has always contributed to it. When the opposite event occurs, your prayer has never been ignored. It has been considered and refused for your ultimate good and the good of the whole universe." Number 8, Bad Therapy by Abigail Schreier. Abigail Schreier is an author and a journalist, and she rose to prominence through her excellent book on the transgender social contagion that was affecting or is affecting young women. It's called Irreversible Damage. That was a very good book. And now she is back in this book to show that the psychology industry writ large is not helping Gen Z's mental health, but actively hurting it. As mental health diagnoses, counseling sessions, gentle parenting, and drug prescriptions climb, so do rates of depression, anxiety, violence, and suicide attempts. And so Schreier argues that the problem is not the kids, it's the mental health experts. She draws on hundreds of interviews with child psychologists, parents, teachers, and young people, and she reveals that many common therapeutic approaches have serious negative side effects and very few proven benefits. It turns out that just like in the medical industry, it is more profitable for you to stay sick than for you to get better. So Schreier makes it clear that she's not against all mental health care. It can be life-saving when it's properly applied to people with severe needs. But for the typical child, the average child, the cure can be worse than the disease. Since reading this book, I've spoken with a few mental health specialists in our church who have also read it, and they have assured me that not all counselors, especially in the conservative Christian counseling industry, are employing the damaging methods that Schreier identifies. There are good counselors and there is good counseling, but just like everything else, the devil is in the details. So here's a few helpful quotes. She says, with unprecedented help from mental health experts, we have raised the loneliest, most anxious, depressed, pessimistic, helpless, and fearful generation on record. This is a remarkably sturdy research finding. Kids are happiest when raised in a loving environment that holds their behavior to high standards, expects them to contribute meaningfully to the household, and is willing to punish when behavior falls short. And it flies in the face of virtually everything therapists and parenting books now exhort. Now, here's one more quote. She says, no industry refuses the prospect of exponential growth, and mental health experts are no exception. By feeding normal kids with normal problems into an unending pipeline, the mental health industry is minting patients faster than it can cure them. Bad Therapy. Number 7, Weapons of Mass Instruction by John Taylor Gatto. John Taylor Gatto, he spent 30 years as a public school educator. He won the New York State Teacher of the Year Award in 1999, and shortly after, he left his teaching profession after realizing that the government school system is not just unintentionally crippling the intellects of young people, but that it is actually intentionally designed to do so. It was built for that. So in Weapons of Mass Instruction, Gatto demonstrates that the harm government schools inflict is rational and deliberate. It's not accidental. He argues that the real purpose of school is to render the common population manageable, to restrict free thinking and turn young people into drones that are perfectly fit for industrial labor. As an alternative, Gatto recommends what he calls open source learning, which imposes no artificial divisions between learning and life. And so this book is a good introduction to understanding the massive failure of government schools that we are currently seeing come to fruition. Here's a few quotes. He says, I've concluded that genius is as common as dirt. We suppress genius because we haven't yet figured out how to manage a population of educated men and women. The solution, I think, is simple and glorious. Let them manage themselves. He goes on, he says, it was from Washington's bribes, subsidies, and cajolings that institutional schooling spread, not from the merit of the idea. He says, looking back on a 30-year teaching career full of rewards and prizes, I can't believe that centralized schooling is allowed to exist at all, as a giant indoctrinating and sorting machine, robbing people of their children. This was a challenging book to get through, but very helpful for me. Number 6, Ordinary by Michael Horton. In evangelicalism today, it's popular to praise the radical, the crazy, the transformative, the transcendent, and all of those things have their places. But when radical becomes the constant expectation, it leads us to feel guilty disillusioned, disappointed, and discontent with the ordinary lives of faithfulness that God has called us to. And so in this book, Pastor Michael Horton shows us that what we need is not another program or a fresh, innovative approach to spiritual growth. Instead, it is a renewed appreciation for the commonplace, for the ordinary. This book is not a call to low expectations or passivity. It's a call to find joy in the ordinary. It's a call to see discipleship as the result of sustained faithfulness over the long haul. This book was very encouraging and empowering to me. It's helped me be content in the non-glamorous elements of life. Horton says, I've come to the point where I'm not sure anymore just what God counts as radical. And I suspect that for me, getting up and doing the dishes when I'm short on sleep and patience is far more costly and necessitates more of a revolution in my heart than some of the more outwardly risky ways I've lived in the past. And this is what I need now, the courage to face an ordinary day. An afternoon with a colicky baby where I'm probably going to snap at my 2-year-old and get annoyed with my noisy neighbor without despair. The bravery it takes to believe that a small life is still a meaningful life, and the grace to know that even when I've done nothing that is powerful or bold or even interesting, that the Lord notices me and is fond of me, and that is enough. Number 5, No Apologies by Anthony Esolen. This was a fun one to read. Anthony Esolen is a professor and a social commentator, and he is on a quest to end the apology tour for traditional masculinity. Boys today are awash in self-loathing. They're taught that their manhood is destructive, it's unnatural, it's abhorrent. But the facts are that it is the strength, the drive, and the ambition of men that builds and upholds civilization itself. Esolen draws on 2 millennia of historical thought to present a vigorous defense of masculine strength. He reminds us that civilization, exploration, invention, architecture, law, justice, politics, peace, and religion are all the result of the often thankless brute labor of men. And if you rob men of the drive to do that labor, you lose all of its results. He writes, Many a boy languishes in school because he finds no arrow there, no purpose there. Things are staid, routine. The failure of boys in school, not this boy or that boy, but boys by the millions, suggests that the schools are quite simply bad for them. They stunt their growth, intellectually and practically. The boys are like pale and spindly plants that have been kept indoors all the days of their lives. And yet, obviously, we need these boys. It is criminally negligent to deny it. Everywhere you turn your eyes in the United States, you will find ugliness, disrepair, vandalism, buildings left to rot, and unemployed or underemployed young men, disheartened, not worth marrying, and ready to cause trouble, since they can cause so little else. This is not a quote from Anthony Esolen. This is a quote from Greg Morse, who's he's a writer at Desiring God, and he reviewed Esolen's book. But this was a good quote, so I threw it in here. Morse says, "Feminism, then, to Esolen, is an ungrateful fantasy, attempting to expel man from the city he built. She scribes her scathing treatise within a well-heated, warmly lit world built and sustained by men. The oil in her pen, the paper upon her desk, the plastic in her Starbucks cup, the electricity in her computer, all join voice together to refute her, but she cannot hear them. So with his engineer's mind, Esolen examines the civilization we take for granted and points repeatedly to the small font scribbled on the infrastructure, made by men. Not by angels or elves, not by women or children, but by men, forgettable, forgotten, and too often flattened. No apologies, then, for men holding the plow to war with the earth. No one else can." It was a fantastic book this year. Number 4, The Things of Earth by Joe Rigney. Joe Rigney is a New Testament professor. He's an author, he's a pastor, and he has been a tremendous help to me in the last few years. In this book, Things of Earth, Joe Rigney offers a breath of fresh air to Christians like me who were burdened by false standards, impossible expectations, and misguided notions of holiness. If you were anything like me, you have long held this latent guilt that you might be enjoying your stuff too much. Like you feel guilty about it. And so Rigney shows that there is a third way between idolatry and ingratitude when it comes to how we value the gifts that God has given us. I grew up singing that the things of earth grow strangely dim in the light of God's glory and grace. And in this book, Joe Rigney shows that the Bible actually teaches the exact opposite. The things of earth grow strangely bright in the light of God, the God who created them. Every good gift comes from the Father's hand, and God's blessings to us should drive us to worship and drive us to generosity. Here's a few quotes. Idolatry begins with a false separation of gift and giver. Rather than a momentary comparison for the sake of testing our affections, idolatry is a permanent separation for the sake of false worship. Sin divides in order to destroy. It tears asunder and leaves the fragments scattered on the ground. The separation of gift from giver ruins our enjoyment of both. He says, a full look at Jesus makes his gifts come alive. When you see Jesus clearly, his gifts come alive. I'll end with this one. God's love for God led him to create the world from nothing. Therefore, our love for God, if it is to be an accurate reflection of God's love, must also lead us to a deep and profound and fitting love for creation. This was a wonderful book this year. Number 3, Economics in One Lesson by Henry Hazlitt. This economic classic is from one of the world's foremost economic thinkers. It's been a foundation in Western free market economics for almost 80 years now. And so in this book, Economics in One Lesson, it's not a textbook written for experts. It is a clear and concise explanation of the power of free markets. And it's meant to educate the average person. In this book, Hazlitt addresses dozens of economic fallacies that have become increasingly prevalent in the West. So he addresses things like social welfare programs, rent control, minimum wage laws, tariffs, exports, price fixing, unions, inflation, and much more. And on every topic, Hazlitt shows how government intervention can only function to decrease production and de-incentivize innovation. And government programs can only be funded through increased taxation. That's the only way to fund anything that the government does. And so the most efficient route to abundance for everyone is a truly free market that is undisturbed by government programs and that minimizes taxes. If you have read any of Thomas Sowell, then you will recognize Hazlitt as kind of his forefather in economics. Here's a few excellent quotes. He says, practically all government attempts to redistribute wealth and income tend to smother productive incentives and lead toward general impoverishment. It is the proper sphere of government to create and enforce a framework of law that prohibits force and fraud, but it must refrain from specific economic interventions. Government's main economic function is to encourage and preserve a free market. He says, we cannot distribute more wealth than is created. That's the kind of quote that once you say it, everybody knows it's true, but he was the first one to say it. We cannot distribute more wealth than is created. We cannot, in the long run, pay labor as a whole more than it produces. Here's a couple more. The larger the percentage of the national income taken by taxes, the greater the deterrent to private production and employment. When the total tax burden grows beyond a bearable size, the problem of devising taxes that will not discourage and disrupt production becomes insoluble. You tax too high and production will go down. I'll end with this one. Either immediately or ultimately, every dollar of government spending must be raised through a dollar of taxation. In this way, the supposed miracles of government spending will appear in another light. This was an eye-opening economics book for me, and again, it's fairly entry level. You don't have to have any expertise to understand it. Number 2, Life in the Negative World by Aaron Renn. Aaron Renn is an author. He's a researcher, a consultant, and a sociologist, and he has been tracking America's declining relationship with evangelicalism for decades now. And so in this book, Life in the Negative World, Renn lays out a 3-stage framework for understanding how our culture sees Christianity. For most of America's history, we lived in a positive world. That's the first stage, meaning that culture viewed Christianity as a positive thing. In the fairly recent past, we transitioned into neutral world, where culture viewed Christianity as a neutral thing. And then in the last 10 years or so, we have shifted definitively into the negative world. And so, how do we as Christians live with integrity, optimism, faithfulness, and missional zeal in a brand new negative world? Should we adopt the same methods and strategies that worked decades ago, or is there another option available to us? Aaron Wren works through these questions and much more in a book that will give you clear eyes to understand the world that we live in today. Here's a few quotes. For the first time in the 400-year history of America, the culture as a whole and key institutions of society have turned negative toward Christianity and Christian morality. He says, this aspect of the negative world, in which a denatured Christianity is acceptable, but Orthodox Christianity is not, pressures evangelicals to find ways to make their theological beliefs align with the ideologies of today's secular culture. That quote explains why we see so much of evangelicalism drifting toward the secular ideology. He says, the negative world thus foretells a shift in emphasis away from relevance and transformation toward being a counterculture. And then here's a resource for you. This book started years ago as an article in American Reformer. So if you want to read the kind of the quick version of this book before he had really researched it and fleshed it out too much, you can scan that QR code and read that article. And number one book of 2024 is Leadership and Emotional Sabotage by Joe Rigney. My number one spot is reserved for a book that has radically shifted my understanding and my approach to leadership in this anxious age that we live in. I read this book 3 times in the last year, twice by myself, and then once with my whole church staff team. And every time there were new layers of discoveries and encouragements and aha moments. Leadership and Emotional Sabotage, Joe Rigney, in this book, he takes the very best of Edwin Friedman's Failure of Nerve, if you're familiar with that book and that concept, and he Christianizes it, and then he delivers it in a short, clear, and immensely practical little book. It's just over 100 pages. You can read it in like an hour. While some people may critique Leadership and Emotional Sabotage for being too simple or too short or too unnuanced, I actually think that that's its greatest strength. So any book on emotions and mental health runs the risk of dying the death of 1,000 qualifications. And Rigney has the guts to just say something clear and then move on. He doesn't nuance things to death. He's willing to risk being misunderstood. And in that way, his whole approach to writing is a good example of the main point of this book, that good Christian leaders are sober-minded enough to resist the sabotage that is inherent in highly anxious systems. In the name of compassion, Christian leaders have often unwittingly been constantly steered by the most anxious and volatile person in the room. How can leaders recover the nerve to lead through the emotional sabotage? That's the question Rigney is addressing. Leadership and Emotional Sabotage not only provides the biblical and historical framework for understanding emotions and authority hierarchies, but it also gives detailed and practical explanation of how men are to lead in the home, in the church, and in the culture. It is only through an unshakable reliance on God that a leader can resist the lure of people-pleasing and man-fearing. It's no exaggeration to say that this book has transformed my leadership and the leadership of my staff team. We are more resilient, more understanding, and more joyful than before. And for that, I am grateful to Joe Rigney for this excellent book. Here's a few quotes. He says, "You must order and govern your loves and appetites. Your passions and emotions must not lead you astray." He says, "We can be drunk on more than alcohol. We suffer the same sort of mental and moral impairment when we are overwhelmed by our passions and the passions of others." Sober-minded leaders are able to faithfully lead their families, churches, businesses, schools, and nations through their glad-hearted and steady presence, bringing stability and life and health amidst the storms of passions that surround us. Similar to C.S. Lewis, Rigney's clarity of language and just cutting way to get right down to the meat of things is always impressive. Here's an example in this quote. He says, "Empathy, like all passions, is meant to be governed by what is true and what is good. It's meant to be tethered to reality, but it frequently becomes a power tool in the hands of the sensitive. It is the means by which the most immature, reactive, and invasive members of a community hijack the agenda and derail the mission. They do this by demanding that the rest of the community adapt to them and their sensitivities." If you have any leadership experience, you likely understand where that quote is coming from. So there we have it, my top 10 books of 2024. I have also included on this slide, let me move my face over so you can see these. I've also included some of my favorite short quotes on reading. I hope that these quotes and this video will motivate you to set a reading goal for 2025 and to build reading into your life. Reading is a muscle that must be developed, but the benefit is impossible to overstate. So thank you guys for watching. I love you. We'll see you later.